Greg Gordon, how many legal claims have been filed with regard to asbestos in this country?
You know, no one knows, which is one of the remarkable things about this whole issue. The dimensions of the asbestos problem, which is one of the real colossal tragedies of the 20th century in America and now into the 21st century, are really not known fully. There are projections by public health experts that before it's over, 500,000 workers will be dead of asbestos-related illnesses.
Very briefly, what is asbestos and why have there been so many lawsuits filed?
Asbestos is a naturally forming mineral that when it flakes off or crumbles, produces microscopic fibers, which when they embed in your lungs can cause about 3 or 4 different progressive lung illnesses, the worst being a rare cancer of the lining of the lungs known as Mesothelioma. It kills about 2,000 to 3,000 people a year, and it's not curable. The reason there are so many lawsuits is that there are so many sick people. Some projections call for more than 2 million Americans to suffer from asbestos-related illnesses before this is over in the next 50 years, if it can be reined in totally.
What was asbestos, or is asbestos, used for industrially, and how do people get exposed to it?
Well, asbestos is, of course, best known as a fire retardant. It was used in fire retardant sprays inside buildings to protect people in case there's a fire. And it's used in brake pads in cars. It's used in horticultural products because asbestos wasn't really used in the horticultural products. Vermiculite that is mined at four mines in the United States contains veins of asbestos, and this wasn't known for a time, and then it was thought by some that it wasn't anything to worry about, but it turns out that it's also claimed a very large toll of Americans with illnesses now.
Okay. What has Congress done? By the way, we're talking about asbestos legislation and lawsuits. If you'd like to dial in, the numbers are on the screen. What has Congress done with regard to asbestos and the lawsuits?
Here's the problem. There are now 67 American companies in bankruptcy because of the huge number of asbestos claims. Hundreds of thousands have already been filed. Johns Manville, which was the biggest producer of asbestos products, went bankrupt some 20 years ago, and it has alone received 20,000 claims. I'm sorry, it has received 600,000 claims, and a large percentage of those have since been settled, but originally they were going to pay 100 cents on the dollar. They're now paying a nickel on the dollar. So a lot of people today are sick and ending up with very little compensation from the companies that were culpable or that were alleged to be culpable.
Has Manville been found culpable? Or just alleged to be?
Essentially admitted culpability. It has a trust that pays out to claimants based on certain medical criteria that they must meet. And there are, as I said, 67 other companies that are in bankruptcy, and many, many other companies. The total number of corporate defendants in asbestos litigation is today about 8,400 in the United States.
And again, the congressional role. Congress's
role has been to try to come up with some kind of a massive settlement that will resolve what is becoming a growing problem, and that is how to take care of these people who are sick, how to compensate their survivors if asbestos shortened their lives. And there have been attempts in Congress for a number of years to try to come up with a global settlement that might sort of mirror that was achieved with the tobacco industry and put into law. This year, there's a great momentum to try to do something, in part, I think, because the business community recognizes that they've got the House, the Senate, and the White House, and that they might be able to get some legislation through that will be a little bit more sympathetic to business than maybe a Democratic Congress might have adopted. And the problem is that there's not really enough money, or there hasn't historically been enough money to go around under any scenario to take care of all these people. And so they're trying to come up with something that will at least be more equitable. Today you have lawsuits being resolved in Mississippi for far larger amounts of money, compensation to victims, than, say, in Montana. It's inequitable. Some people happen to be victims of companies that went into Chapter 11 bankruptcy, and they get a much less money in the end than a victim of, say, a General Motors or a Ford that are still operating companies and maybe got exposed to too much asbestos dust off brake pads.
Why are we talking about this today?
Senator Orrin Hatch, the chairman of the Judiciary Committee, with some cooperation and collaboration from Senate Democrats, has been trying to forge a compromise deal for months. It's gone on for about 4 months now, and today Senator Hatch plans to formally introduce draft legislation that would maybe be the start of attempts in Congress to mark up something that would be acceptable to all parties. The problem is that the AFL-CIO, which essentially represents union workers, is very unhappy with what the senator is finally putting in after all these talks.
Why?
Well, the number that I didn't see a number in the 111-page bill that the senator is, and it could have changed in the last couple of days, but the draft measure that he circulated 2 days ago did not have a global number in it that I could find, but I'm told that it would involve about $108 billion over 26 years, essentially. But presumably the plan would be to cover victims going back or going forward for maybe 40, 50 years. Labor says the number is too low, and its chief concern is the description and the standards for the medical criteria that victims would have to meet to be compensated. What kind of rigorous testing would they have to go through? What kind of proof would they have to make before they would be covered? And then there's a scale for diseases ranging from what is known as pleural disease, which is a certain amount of scarring on your lung, on the pleura of your lungs, which is the outer lining. And this is what causes the breathing problems that these people encounter. Or you could have asbestosis, a much more serious restrictive lung disease, or lung cancer, or at the top, in the worst case, mesothelioma, the disease I mentioned a few minutes ago. And the AFL-CIO doesn't feel there's enough money in for some of these categories.
Okay, let's get our callers involved here. First call up is from, let's see, our first call up is from Detroit. Good morning. Detroit, you're on the air.
Can you hear me all right?
Go ahead.
Yes, good morning.
All right, I've got a comment and a question. A real quick comment is I don't think the American people understand just how hard it is to litigate against a major corporation. I was involved in a lawsuit for 4 years, and finally, in exasperation, everybody just settled for pennies on the dollar. And when you contact your agencies, your governmental agencies, specifically the SEC, you'll find that there's no cops on the beat and there's nobody home. These agencies have been gutted. My question for you, sir, is I see that you investigate these type of things. Have you ever investigated the biological hazards other than other neurotoxins, especially electromagnetic radiation that comes from towers, high kilovolt transmission lines? Recently there was a study finally came out by the EPA about how this causes cancer and how this is really a this is a more serious carcinogen than asbestos, neurotoxins, and causes a lot of diseases.
Greg Gordon.
Well, I have to say, in a former job, I worked for the Detroit News, and I actually did a 4-part series on toxins in the workplace other than asbestos. And one thing I would say about asbestos is that asbestos is easier to litigate because it leaves scarring on the lungs, and it leaves asbestos fibers in the body. If you have exposure to something like, say, cobalt dust or some of these chemicals and solvents that are used in the auto industry, they leave your body, and then you have to turn around and try to prove your exposure 20 or 30 years before you got cancer, and it's extremely difficult, as you say. And in fact, a lot of the toxic tort bar, as they call the lawyers who represent victims of various toxins, has dried up. I haven't done any work on electromagnetic fields, but I know if you buy a cell phone and you look at the brochure that comes with your cell phone, it says, "We don't know whether or not it causes cancer." So proceed with that knowledge. There are many, many substances in the environment that people can be exposed to that is very difficult to litigate. I agree.
Pensacola, Florida. Good morning.
Hey, how you doing?
Good.
Hi, Mr. Gordon.
Good morning.
I'd like to know who's really in control of this taking care of people that have been exposed to asbestos, because I tell you, I spent 20 years in the Navy, 73 to 93. I was exposed to asbestos in 73, and it was on my service record all the way up till I retired. In 94, I went to the VA and found out I had asbestosis. Well, I didn't have any symptoms, so I said, well, I'll just wait till I start having symptoms and then I'll file. Well, I started having symptoms in 1998, and I went ahead and went to file, and they told me that you had to file within 2 years, and if you didn't, you were just out of luck. So here I am with the asbestosis, and I can't get a dime from anybody. I can't get anybody to say to do anything. So who's really in charge of this money? Is this the government or the big industries controlling the people like us that are sick and not being able to get any retribution?
Caller, who is your suit against, and are you part of a class action?
No, like I said, they know exactly who. See, I was tearing down some barracks on NES Pensacola, so they know, it's on my service record, they know exactly who put the asbestos in there. But it doesn't matter because I did not file within the 2 years. In Florida, you have to file within 2 years of being diagnosed. It doesn't matter if you're showing signs or not, and that's basic. It's a trick to me, because like I said, I had no symptoms whatsoever, but now that I do, I can't get any retribution for it.
Thanks, caller.
This is one of the things that's wrong with the current system, although there will be a similar statute of limitations in the federal legislation if it stays as Senator Hatch has drafted it. And what you describe is a plight or predicament that has hit all too many people. The states have various statute of limitations. Some of them go up to 6 years, which you mentioned in 1992 you were diagnosed and you started having symptoms in 98. But this is one of the problems, and it's also sort of an irony about the current system. The courts are facing or trying to deal with hundreds of thousands of suits that have been filed. And the industry says so many of these suits are filed on behalf of people who aren't sick. Well, the problem is once you develop or your lungs show scarring at the bottom end, where you might have pleural thickening, scarring that causes your pleura to thicken, but you don't have any symptoms yet. Asbestos is a progressive disease, and it takes a while. Sometimes it can take up to 40 years before serious symptoms develop. But you have been diagnosed with an asbestos illness, technically, and you are on notice to file a claim against the defendant's companies that you feel put you in a situation where you were exposed. So you're in a real problem, and the courts have all kinds of cases involving people who aren't sick yet but have an asbestos illness, technically.
Next call for Greg Gordon of the Minneapolis Star-Tribune on asbestos comes from DeKalb, Illinois. Democrat.
Hello, Mr. Gordon.
Good morning.
Good morning. You mentioned Johns Manville, but isn't W.R. Grace the biggest polluter of asbestos in the country?
No. John's Manville produced about a third of the asbestos that was commercially manufactured in the United States and distributed. W.R. Grace has had a couple 300,000 claims filed against it for various products it produced, including fire retardant sprays, which I mentioned before, were used for many years in buildings to try to help contain a fire if it broke out. And it also made the vermiculite attic insulation that we have as a current issue now in Minnesota and in states across the country where plants used asbestos-contaminated vermiculite to make a variety of products. And W.R. Grace owned many of those plants or provided the contaminated vermiculite ore to many of those plants.
Next call, Greenwood, South Carolina. Good morning.
Yes, sir. I was just wondering, I remember when they took all the asbestos out of the schools and the government spent billions of dollars removing this asbestos, only to find out later that as long as it was stationary or undisturbed, it wasn't harmful to anybody. I wonder what else are we going to find out about asbestos I mean, how do you determine who has lung problems from asbestos or from smoking 3 packs of cigarettes a day, or what? Where does it end?
Thank you, caller.
You have hit on a point of contention in the current negotiations because smoking and asbestos have a certain synergy. In fact, if you are a smoker and you're also exposed to asbestos, your chances of getting lung cancer go up exponentially. In the draft bill that the senator has proposed, a person who smoked or smokes and suffers from lung cancer will get $50,000. A non-smoker who has lung cancer and an asbestos exposure would get $400,000. The AFL-CIO feels that the number for smokers who are exposed to asbestos is way too low and must come up, and in fact that the other number must come up also. But this is the big debate because the AFL-CIO has a number that is tens of billions of dollars higher than the $108 billion that is apparently on the table from industry right now, and the insurance industry, I should add. Both the corporations and corporate defendants and the insurance industry would be chipping into this big pot.
Next call for Greg Gordon is Waupaca, Wisconsin. Good morning.
Good morning, and thank you for taking my call. I'm a first-time caller, and C-SPAN is very, very important to me. My husband has been on oxygen. It will be 6 years in August, and he has asbestosis. I have been so offended at the companies that are filing bankruptcy purely to get out of covering those people that have been injured by products that they put out.
Caller, where was your husband exposed to asbestos?
My husband was in construction, heavy-duty construction for years, and he was exposed at various places where they had to remove the asbestos. And we know that it was ordered by the government. However, that is not the fault of the client who has the problem now. And I was especially offended when our vice president, who was the CEO of that big company who bought a company that did sell asbestos, and he said that these lawsuits were frivolous. I would like the vice president to see what my husband has to go through. We have oxygen 24/7 in our home.
Okay, thanks, caller. Greg Gordon.
What you're describing, the emotions that you're describing, the anger, is shared by many Americans, American workers and their families. That's all I can tell you. There are a lot of people very frustrated right now. The idea that they can only get pennies on the dollar, and there's a lot of skepticism about some of these bankruptcies, whether companies were doing this essentially to get out of their responsibilities.
When was it discovered that asbestos could be damaging?
The famed researcher Irving Selikoff at Mount Sinai Hospital in New York in the early 1960s, around 1963 or 1964, was coming out with some very serious health warnings. And here we are 40 years later, and we still have new asbestos exposures occurring in the United States. And in fact, there's legislation also pending on Capitol Hill to ban asbestos. Something in the range of 30 million tons came into or were produced in the United States or imported last year.
And who are normal people who aren't involved in heavy-duty construction or tearing it out of schools exposed to asbestos?
You can be exposed in casual ways. Steve McQueen died of mesothelioma. I'm not sure if anyone knows how he was exposed. We just lost Congressman Bruce Vento of Minnesota a couple of years ago. He was diagnosed in February of, I believe it was 2001. How had he been exposed? Died in late fall that year of mesothelioma. He was a school teacher when he got out of college, and during the summers and sometimes at nights, he worked in various factories for a few years around the Twin Cities. His widow has a lawsuit, and family has a lawsuit pending against the industry.
Westchester County, New York. Good morning.
Good morning, Mr. Gordon. Well done on your investigative reporting, by the way.
Thank you very much.
It seems that we have a disease, mesothelioma, and the only cure, apparent cure, are more lawsuits. And I'm sure you'll agree with that. There is a program out there, I know as a gentleman called earlier regarding electromagnets and stuff like that, but there's a very successful program that was utilized for drug problems for people that had, on a cellular level, particles and toxins in the body. And I know it's been used on guys coming back from Vietnam with Agent Orange, and also as early as a few months ago, it's still being very effective in New York City with the firemen. And it's called a purification program. And this program actually eliminates toxins and poisons and pulls it out of the system. It's a combination of sweat program and medically supervised. And the Church of Scientology is the one that has this program, and it's ongoing for years, and it's got the highest non-recidivity rate in the world when it comes to heroin addicts. Not only it handles toxins and poisons, you've probably seen a commercial on TV about purification. It showed like a volcano exploding, and what it does is it actually handles the toxins and poisons and pulls it out of the tissues, which basically even LSD can remain in your system for many, many years. And so it's something that should be looked at, I think, because we're putting a lot of attention on lawsuits and creating a disease than really finding a cure.
Thank you, caller. Greg Gordon.
Well, I'm sure that the scientific community will be very interested in any approach that will rid these toxins from people's bodies. That's all I can say.
But going back to the lawsuit question, a lot of commercials, at least here in the D.C. area, about mesothelioma. You see a lot, and call this lawyer's number if you have it. Are the trial lawyers active in this?
The trial lawyers are in a very interesting position. They're a significant portion, probably a small fraction overall, of the tort bar is devoted entirely to bringing asbestos-related lawsuits. And the lawyers could be the big losers if such a settlement is reached. And that's really the big impetus for the settlement. The Rand Institute for Civil Justice contends that 61 or 60%, I guess it's maybe it's 59 to 61%, somewhere in that range, of the overall costs of asbestos litigation over the last 20, 30 years has been for legal fees, both defense and for the plaintiff's fees. And this means that if a victim wins, say, $1 million for a mesothelioma case, it might, he or she might end up with $667,000 or $600,000, or maybe even only $500,000. Not to say the lawyers take a lot of risk. It's almost all done on contingency. But if this settlement is reached, the lawyers' roles will be diminished considerably. They may be needed to navigate people through the system, but it won't be. It'll be a pretty well prescribed arrangement.
Omaha, Nebraska, you're on the air with Greg Gordon.
Yeah, I want to ask, first of all, I didn't hear what sort of, well, I've worked in construction, and I wanted to know what kind of concentration of exposure it takes to, potentially develop asbestosis, and also in regards to if you know anything about silica. I worked a lot with acoustical tile ceilings, where there's a potential silica exposure, and fiberglass insulation.
Let's get an answer caller out of time.
You may not know this, but one of the international agencies recently named silica dust as a carcinogen, a cancer causer. And how much exposure is not really known, except I think for asbestosis probably a fair amount. But mesothelioma, some scientists feel that a casual exposure to asbestos can cause mesothelioma in 20, 30, 40 years later.
Greg Gordon is with the Minneapolis Star-Tribune, an investigative reporter and also a correspondent here in Washington. If people want to read your past articles on asbestos, where can they find them?
StarTribune.com will have a fair number of them.
Thanks for joining us this
It's
morning
my
to talk
pleasure.
about asbestos. Coming up, the House is in session. They'll be doing the Defense Department $400 billion appropriation is what they'll be talking about. Two hearings you might be interested in that we'll be covering today on C-SPAN includes the 9/11 Commission. Lee Hamilton and Tom Kean were out here earlier to talk about that. They'll be hearing from John McCain and other senators. Jane Garvey, former FAA administrator, will be there. Also, the House Select Committee on Homeland Security will be hearing from Tom Ridge today. Both those hearings will be on C-SPAN. The Tom Ridge Homeland Security hearing will be live on C-SPAN 3 beginning just about right now. Otherwise, check cspan.org for scheduling. Tomorrow we'll be in New York City. John Batchelor of Batchelor and Alexander WABC radio program will be one of our guests. We'll see you tomorrow. The House is now in session.